And a lot of people would like to get to the point one of these days where you could take them out and fly them much in the same way you do an airliner. That's down the road. That's considerably down the road, but it was encouraging, I think, to everyone in the space community to hear him say that the program and the dreams of the people that we lost today will continue.
I have you, I think, and John Pike and Jim Oberg on the line. So at the risk of rushing ahead of ourselves here, Jim Oberg is still here, John Pike is gone. In August of 1995, a NASA manager with about 30 years experience in the NASA program wrote to President Clinton about what he said were his concerns about the safety and the concern for safety in the shuttle program. And his letter was posted on a website, the Federation of American Scientists at the time. And I wonder if I might ask you first, Jim, and then Jim Slade, and then Jim Oberg, whether or not these concerns about safety, which are on occasion in every industry expressed by individuals, in this case in a letter to the President, were real in 1995, and whether or not they were rectified.
Indeed, they have been expressed over the years, and a lot of that concern comes from reduction in workforce. A lot of people were being reduced in the force, and at the same time, the old experienced people were beginning to retire from the force. New ones that were subsequently brought into it didn't have the experience that was there to carry them through. Each one of these shuttles has its own preparation team. And I'm sure that now at the Kennedy Space Center, the team that was dedicated to Columbia will be brought together, and the experience level will be one of the things that's sorted out.
Jim Oberg, let me ask you roughly the same question. Jose Garcia, in writing this letter to President Clinton, said the safety of the shuttle needs your help. In their misguided attempt to economize, they've lost sight of what keeps the shuttle safe. There are ways to economize and still keep the shuttle safe without dismantling the best launch team in the world. How do we take that in the context of what happened today?
A lot of these things were being of concern in the 90s, the mid-90s. Some of it was addressed. We do know that people in the shuttle preparation at the Kennedy Space Center have stood up and said, stop. We've got one man only a few months ago grounded the entire fleet because he saw something unusual during a microscopic inspection of the interior of a rocket engine, and he was rewarded and praised for doing that. So the question is going to be, did we not catch something? We're going to find that out. Or did something just happen perhaps during this ascent and the impact on the wing, perhaps something else that we have yet to determine? We'll find out whether it was whether we overlooked something or whether it was, in fact, a surprise. The people involved there people working in the shuttle program, the space program, aren't here for the money. And the management seems to know that because they're mostly underpaid. But they're there because they love to do this, and they spend incredible amounts of extra time doing it. So they catch a lot. The question is, did they catch everything? We'll find out.
Let me ask, again, roughly the same question of you, Norm Thagard. Is there any reason, as best you can tell, why the public should be concerned about a climate of safety or lack thereof in the program today?
I don't think so. My impression has been in the last few years, NASA has been very, very concerned with safety, and if there is anything that anyone points out that has a safety matter involved with it, then the managers pay attention to it and they sort it all out, and they don't proceed until they feel comfortable.
And so you take it as a very good sign that, as Jim said a short while ago, somebody can close down 4 shuttles when they find something which they regard as minuscule in one of the rocket propulsion systems.
Absolutely, and it always made me feel real good that the folks were experts and looked at the areas, and if they had any problems, they were not at all shy about voicing those.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to go back to the Kennedy Space Center now, where ABC's Tom Jarrell is standing by with Senator Bill Nelson of Florida, a former astronaut himself, flew on Columbia. Why don't you guys have a chat?
Indeed, Peter. And Senator, the first question, you've been through what the crew members in effect went through today during that phase of the flight, returning to the Space Center. Inside that spacecraft, what's it like? What do you see? What do you feel?
At around 200,000 feet, they are feeling beginning of the reentry into the atmosphere, and that is heating up the space shuttle. It's going to be 3,000 degrees on the underside of the space shuttle. We were on the night side of the Earth, so out the window it looked like we were in daylight, reflecting all of the red-orange glow. At that point, it is very important that the computers are operating perfectly to keep the angle of attack at exactly the right angle, because if you get your nose too low, you're going to burn up. Your tail too low, or if it dips to one side, you've got to distribute that heat and repel that heat by those silicon tiles that are on the underside of the shuttle.
The computer, though, is flying the spacecraft at that moment.
That's correct.
Would that hint that this could have been a computer problem? I know a huge investigation is necessary, but is that a possibility?
It could have been. We just don't know until we get the data. There was some indication that there was a temperature change in one of the wings, but we just won't know until we get the data.
But if that craft doesn't fly exactly right as it re-enters with the heat on the shield, it's all over.
That's correct, and that's why space flight is risky business. The asset, the re-entry, they're very, very difficult tasks.
Is there any escape mechanism for the crew at that altitude and at that speed? Any way out?
No, you are totally at the mercy of having that spacecraft come down through the atmosphere slowing it, the atmosphere heating it up as it slows, and then once the spacecraft gets to about 50,000 feet, the commander takes over manual control and he flies it in, only he doesn't have an engine. He's got a short, stubby-winged, fat glider that glides like a rock. But those pilot astronauts are so good they can put it on a dime.
This has not been considered a critical, dangerous phase where you hold your breath and hope they make it. This has been more or less routine. Is it a mistake to think of anything in spaceflight as routine and not dangerous?
Listen, this phase of the flight, anyone who has flown, you are holding your breath and saying a prayer when there is the radio blackout, that shuttle is going to emerge from that radio blackout, because that is a very risky part of the flight.
Now, the second person Administrator O'Keefe called after the president was Tom Ridge, the head of Homeland Security. Homeland Security, we're told, is in charge of finding and collecting and protecting the debris from the shuttle as it's found. Homeland Security is in charge of terrorism in this country. Would you expect that that is an element that will have to be investigated as far as this crash is concerned?
Yes, it will be investigated, and that's the first thing that jumps to your mind now that we're in a war against terrorists. But it's very unlikely. If there was to be an act of sabotage, it likely would have been attempted at the launch time, not well into the mission while the mission's on the way home. So I don't think that it will be sabotage is what we find. I think it will be a malfunction and a part of the risk that every astronaut accepts when they go into space.
Tom?
Yes, Peter.
I'm very grateful because you've asked precisely the questions about computers, which I think the Senator's touched on. But, Senator, I have just one question, if I may. This business of the angle of attack as you're coming into the atmosphere and the atmosphere is slowing down. Let's say it's a computer mistake of X degrees. How forgiving, what's the forgiving area? How different can it be and still survive it?
You can't have a lot of error, Peter, because of the intense heat. The engineering design of the shuttle so that those molecules of air, as the air gets denser and denser, the lower you get. And as that heat builds up, it's got to hit and be repelled at the place of the thickest of the silicon tiles. And if it isn't, then you're going to start burning through structure. Now, another possibility is if you just get a couple of those tiles that rip off, you should be okay. But if you get a ripple effect where a lot of them are coming off in a domino effect, then that allows the heat to get into the structure, and that could be catastrophic as well.
But as you listen to the rest of the day, you're going to be listening for what you and Tom focused on there, which is computer error at the point of reentry.
Well, that's clearly one of the possibilities. This indication that there was a temperature differential in the left wing is clearly some signal that has something to do with it. So we're just going to have to wait for the data.
I'm sorry, I hadn't heard about temperature differential in the left wing. What are you talking about?
Did that have something to do with a landing gear or one of the wheels that may have shown a different temperature that they had an alert actually from the spacecraft, as I understand it?
Tom, we just simply don't know. There is not the information for me to even speculate about here.
Okay. Thank you both. Tom, thank you very much. Thank you, Senator Nelson. Very much appreciate your time. Senator Bill Nelson, former astronaut, flew on Columbia, in fact. Senator from Florida mentioning a couple of things there, which we'll get to. We're actually going to stay on the air here for at least another 30 minutes or so until NASA comes along and briefs, as it said it would, in about 25 or 30 minutes from now. And there'll be an opportunity then for reporters, and of course it's the specialists who are down at the Cape and at Houston who will ask the questions now that many of us in the lay community don't really know how to ask. But there are certainly two questions there. As Senator Nelson says, but was the computer off, and did it change the angle of attack and therefore leave the aircraft, leave the shuttle vulnerable to the extraordinary heat in the atmosphere as it's re-entering? We've talked a lot about the debris at this moment over quite a large area in Texas particularly, and Mike Von Fremd is out at Nacogdoches in Texas. And were you there, Mike?
Yes, Peter, I just can see a sign. I'm 7 miles outside of downtown Nacogdoches.
And what do you see?
For about the past 30 miles, Peter, I've seen about a half dozen cases where police are roping off, literally in people's front yards, debris. I've also seen hikers all gathered around the side of the road. People are picking up pieces of the shuttle. And, Peter, as I've been driving, they're using the emergency broadcast system, pleading with people not to take it home. But callers are calling in saying that they've picked up what appears to be a tile of the space shuttle. They're trying to be helpful. They're even reading serial numbers off it to see if it does any good. But it's going to be a nightmare to try and stop, I guess, what will be some souvenir hunters. I mean, the police are frantically trying to tape it all off. They're trying to get the word out. But the debris field is just hundreds of miles long, and it's going to be a tough task.
And Mike, have you actually seen debris yourself?
Yes, I have. It was in the front yard, just a little tiny place off of Highway 259. I've seen literally half a dozen places where the police have put the yellow tape up, and one piece was big enough for me to get a bit of a look at. From listening to the radio, the town that I'm driving in on, Peter, they've closed the airport down here in Nacogdoches because there's apparently quite a large piece on the runway, and I got 5 miles more to go, but I'm told there's a bunch of it in downtown Nacogdoches here.
And can you give us some sense, and I raise this because there's been some question earlier from Jim Oberg that the size of the debris, of course, will be a helpful clue to what actually happened. What's the largest piece you've seen?
The largest piece I've seen only looks to me was about 2 feet, and I could see it literally in the front yard of a tiny little place. And there was a bunch of hikers that were on the side of the road that looked to me like they were looking at a shingle. And they were all gathered around, and the police were driving on up the highway. But what I hear on the radio is it runs the gamut from little tiny particles to, as I said, at the airport here in Nacogdoches, something that's about 7-8 feet long.
Thanks, Mike, very much. Please check back in Mike Von Fremd on his way into Nacogdoches. It is Nacogdoches, where we have been told, and Mike seems to confirm that, where the largest amount of debris has been discovered so far, though it's been detected all the way to the Texas-Louisiana border, over, as Mike described, as several hundred miles. And this is described to us by the Deputy Administrator of NASA this morning as being terribly important because how it falls gives them a more precise opportunity to figure out how the shuttle actually broke up and at what point it began to break up as it was attempting to return to Earth. Lynn Scher covered space for us for a long time. I'm reminded here now that we went through this with the Columbia debris, or with the Challenger debris.
And Peter, it was a much more difficult process, you'll recall, because all of that debris fell into the water. A lot of it sunk to the bottom. Think of all those giant barges that had to go out. Do you remember to drag in the external fuel tank debris, that sort of thing? This is, the rocket boosters rather, this is a very different situation, although I must tell you I am struck by the parallel that Challenger exploded right after it launched. Columbia, just as it was about to touch down, not necessarily both in plain view, but with people waiting for it. Think about it. These people were not awakened by a phone call in the middle of the night. They're standing there while this is happening. There's also another point that I think is an interesting parallel. During the Rogers Commission hearings, which were, of course, the investigation into what happened with Challenger, I was sitting in the press gallery when Richard Feynman, the genius physicist, took a piece of rubber, just like in the O-rings, and dunked it into his ice water on the table. It was a eureka moment. Everybody gasped because it was too hard. There was no more pliability. And this, of course, got to the point that the weather was too cold, and of course the O-rings were the problem. Are we going to have another eureka moment? Will there be enough debris? Will there be enough telemetry information for them to figure out? That's what NASA is going to work very slowly to find out, Peter.
You're of course talking to people, to some people in the audience who do not remember the Rogers Commission or the investigation or even the O-rings that were found, or that moment when these little rubber rings, which were like gaskets, were revealed to become so brittle between the particular pieces of steel. On the other hand, Lynn, what is fascinating of the Rogers Commission, the former Secretary of State, Bill Rogers, that they did get to it. They finally got to this extraordinarily tiny thing which has caused the Challenger disaster.
And there are folks that I've spoken to today at NASA, none of whom are willing to go on the record yet, who are saying it's altogether possible they're going to know very soon. That does not necessarily mean they will fly right away. What they're saying to me is, if this is a unique failure, if this is something they can pinpoint and say this only happened in this case, in this return, then theoretically they could fly very quickly. Will they? We're used to the fact that they've become very, very prudent at NASA, and it's likely they'll wait a lot longer. You know, after the Challenger explosion, the astronauts sort of fell into about three categories. There was a group that had already flown, there was a group that knew they had a long ways to go, and there was a group that said, we'll wait it out. That middle group that said, the first group that said, we've already flown, a lot of them left because they saw the handwriting on the wall. They knew they were not going to go right away. The issue here is, how long will it take to get the remaining fleet up and going? There are three shuttles left, as you've mentioned. Are they enough to maintain the schedule that NASA wants? Do they have to build another orbiter, or do they want to go to the next stage of that? These are all giant questions to be answered.
Well, and one of them, I'm going to turn to Jim Slade, who unlike you and me, I think covers this even more intently today than we used to. The possibility of needing a fourth shuttle, Jim, in order to continue to service the International Space Station?
I really don't think so, Peter, for the very simple reason that Columbia was never intended to go to the space station.
Right.
It was too heavy. Let me add a footnote to what was reported just a few moments ago about tiles being picked up.
Right.
Each one of those tiles has a serial number on it, which denotes where it was located on the space shuttle and when it was applied to the space shuttle and who did the job. Each one of those tiles does. Don't take those. Make sure NASA gets them back, because the one you have in your hand, if you're a tourist, if one of those you have in your hand might have come from the place that caused the accident. Also, what piqued my curiosity when Bill Nelson was on was the thermal differential in the left wing.
Yeah, it caught my attention too, but at least you know what it means, and I didn't.
Well, what piques my curiosity, Peter, is that is the place, or at least the left wing, was the place where that foam insulation from the fuel tank struck the wing during liftoff. Now, this shuttle was not carrying a robot arm, which means there was no camera that they could stick under to see how extensive the damage was under the wing. So that is also going to be open to conjecture.
You know, how very interesting. John Nance on the same subject. John?
Well, Jim makes a very good point, and this is extremely important, and I guess it does take the forum to a certain extent of a bit of a plea to the public, because in an aircraft accident and in any sort of a complex accident, the smallest little thing that might seem completely disconnected can be, I hate to use the old smoking gun thing, but it can be the key to understanding that. One of those tiles could be the key. It's very, very important that we get all of that back that can possibly be recovered. By the way, I wonder if we probably should make note of the fact that even though this terrible thing has happened today, this is the 100th year from Kitty Hawk.
That's right.
Peter. It's the 100th anniversary of manned flight in any form. And how far we've come even with an accident like this, I think is something important. And if I may, one other thing.
I'm going to come back to you on the one other thing, but you
Sure.
say something which fascinating. We did a piece on World News Tonight last night about this pilot who's been trying to recreate the Wright brothers flight 100 years later, and the Wright brothers didn't leave any plans, and so learning how to fly this aircraft is extraordinary. And it's very interesting you raise it today, because with the president mentioning, and everybody else mentioning, of course, the adventure and the danger in flight, takes you back 100 years, and 100 years later they can hardly fly that airplane.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, you were going to say something else. I apologize.
Well, no, not at all. Just one thing, and that is when we talk about, and several folks have made these points about how one individual can stop the whole shuttle program because of one problem. That is a development that occurred only after Challenger. We did not have that as the culture of NASA before Challenger. So one of the tremendous things that was the advancement after that was the ability to get everybody on the team and get that smallest voice, or give that smallest voice the ability to say, hey, wait a minute, we've got a problem.
I appreciate it. Please don't go away. I want to go back to Norm Thagard, one of our resident astronauts today, with us more than most, which is really great. Norm, this business of Columbia not being needed to go to the International Space Station because it's too heavy, therefore the International Space Program not necessarily needing another shuttle.
Well, that's true. You do lose flexibility, however, because you can use the Columbia for missions not involving the International Space Station. The International Space Station is up at a fairly high inclination of 51 degrees, and that's a little tough for a heavier vehicle to get to.
And what did you make of what Senator Nelson said about computers and temperature differentials, etc.?
It is possible for a computer malfunction to cause the problem, but it's unlikely. First of all, there are 4 computers running in a redundant set, and if anything happens, the set can vote out the bad computer. So I think that's not likely. However, the fact that there was a heat difference could be significant, and I'm sure that'll be one of the things they'll look at.
You remind me, of course, that throughout the entire shuttle program, there are indeed 4 computers for everything. Quite extraordinary backup in the system.
There are 4 computers running in so-called redundant set, and if all 4 of those have a problem and can't decide among themselves the nature of the problem, then they'll vote themselves out, and you can engage the backup computer, which has software developed by a completely different group of people.
And I don't want to take us down a road which is unjustified, but talk about this temperature differential on the left wing, given what Jim Slade just added, that something may have hit the left wing on liftoff and they couldn't see it subsequently because they never opened the shuttle's payload bay.
Yes, and the fact that there was something that hit there, and the temperature differential certainly makes you wonder.
Well, you were shuttle commander, so if you saw a temperature differential in your left wing, what would you think?
Well, actually, I was not a shuttle commander. I was flight engineer on a couple of flights and the payload commander on another flight. But if I saw a differential like that, if it were minor, I might not think much about it. And especially with no context, this is one of those things that after the fact probably looms a lot larger than it did at the time it was first seen.
I take your point, but had there been something here, could they have done anything about it?
At that point, there's not anything you can do about it. That is the whole problem. You can't turn around at that point and decide, well, we need to go back to space. If you knew you had a problem beforehand, I guess you could elect to stay on the International Space Station until you could sort out the problem. But at the point at which this became apparent, there was no option.
Let me turn to Jim Oberg for a second. And Jim, read something to you from a report done by the General Accounting Office in January 2001, because well, we've been dealing with this for several hours now. We have not lost sight and will not lose sight of the fact that 7 lives were lost, 2 women, and an Israeli pilot, 6 Americans and 1 Israeli, who'd flown in rotation, as a lot of people did from other countries on the Space Shuttle. But the whole issue of safety has surfaced now. And Jim, there's a GAO report from 2001 that says the NASA shuttle workforce had declined significantly in recent years to the point of reducing NASA's ability to safely support the shuttle program. What do you think?
Well, I think that the people involved in the program thought they could do it safely. And you don't stay in the program if you don't. People in this program don't get shut up by orders. They're a very loud and very rambunctious group, as you know, and they will complain. The people at the Cape said they needed more help, but they said they could do it safely. That no one is going to step aside and say, well, we don't have enough to do it safely, but I'm going to go ahead and do my job anyway. The people in the Space Shuttle program and elsewhere in space are much more dedicated to the mission than that. So whether or not there was something whether there was an oversight will yet to be determined, or whether it was some kind of accident on the wing. We'll work on that. There's all kinds of stories coming in, and by the way, we couldn't look under the wing, not because the doors were open because the radiators are on, but there was no robot arm to put a camera under the wing. That's why we couldn't see it. People on the ground looked at those videos and did not think there was serious damage, but there sure could have been. And a lot of the data, a lot of the rumors we're now hearing seem to be consistent. Now, we got to step back, Peter. As we know, these kinds of accidents create a flood of rumors, suppositions, judgments, and bad guesses that can overwhelm the actual signal behind it. So right now, the main concern is pick those pieces up. I've seen them on TV. I'll tell you, Peter, it's the first time today that I've wept when I saw those pieces on the ground. But I certainly took my time out. It sure brought it home to me.
Jim, stay with us for just a second. Let's not lose sight. Can we go back to that picture that we've just been looking at, please? Because this is what it's about. And we all were somewhat frenzied this morning about, what did NASA know? Was there a possibility that the astronauts had survived in the command capsule? And NASA naturally didn't say anything. And it was only when they went out and lowered the flag to half-mast at the Kennedy Space Center, which is such a popular place for people to visit at Cape Canaveral, that we really understood, that they understood, that 7 of their astronauts had lost their lives. Commander Rick Husband, 45, pilot Bill McCool, 41, Dave Brown, a Navy pilot and a doctor who was 46. He was there, and as they went out and lowered this flag, as we've heard so many times, the space community all across the country, people who focused on the space program in any imaginable way, had gone out to look at that flag and realize that they had lost comrades, friends, colleagues, other people. Ilan Ramon, a colonel in the Israeli Air Force, Kalpana Chawla, who was one of the payload specialists on board, scientists on board, Laurel Clark, who'd also been on board. 7 people who lost their lives, and then the president, as you know, decided that the flag at the White House should be flown at half-staff, and it will be the case again, as it was a couple of years ago, all across the country. And people in other countries have a hard time understanding, on occasion, how it is that we in America gather around in this very personal, national, hugely group way to identify with and mourn and talk about the circumstances of losing 7 people, but that's just the way it is. And there's the flag in front of the Washington Monument, acknowledging loss, and of course behind it in the form of the Washington Monument, reminding us about the endurability and the flexibility of the country. Jim Orberg, we've been talking a little bit about the space tiles. Somebody's just handed me a little piece of one, and it feels very delicate. Would you describe it for us one more time?
These tiles are almost like frozen smoke. They're made of fiber, quartz fiber that are very light, but they will reflect the heat back during reentry, because all the rocket force you see during launch, during those 8.5 minutes of launch, all that thunder puts energy into the shuttle. That energy keeps it in space by its high speed. Coming back to the atmosphere, that energy's got to be dissipated through the impact of the heat with the atmosphere.
Can you see a monitor?
On our local affiliate here, we have the local Channel 13, and they're doing images from the impact area, so I don't see the national.
Well, I'm holding up a little, and as you said, it's like smoke. It's like layers upon layers upon layers of delicate light material. Is that meant to absorb the heat and the energy?
It's meant mostly to reflect it back. The heat is in the shock wave, which is usually a few inches to a few feet in front of the shuttle, and it hits the tile and is radiated back, so the tiles will keep the understructure cool enough. Now, if there was impact that broke some of the tiles on the left wing from some debris, just as a hypothesis, it could cause extra heating to soak into the wing structure. And I think the kind of thing you'd worry about then is not so much the wing melting off as the air drag across that rough section of the wing, jerking the shuttle to the left, causing a violent left turn. If that was the case, that would then turn the shuttle sideways into the wind, and the air blast alone at Mach 12 would go ahead and just destroy it.
So you really believe it's all about attitude?
It's pointing the shuttle correctly. It's not so much the flight path, the descent path was accurate because they used rockets to push themselves onto that path. But pointing the nose in the right direction, not getting more than 10 or 15 degrees off that pointing. But they've done that 110, 115 times before. Something interfered with their ability to keep the nose pointed properly.
Something interfered with their ability to keep the noise or the attitude of the space shuttle in its correct position.
I think so.
Yeah. Now, these tiles that we've just been looking at, they're designed, I think, to be used on at least 100 flights. But when Columbia was refurbished recently, would they have all been replaced?
No, a lot of the tiles over the years, many of the tiles, it turned out, were excessive amounts of protection. They began using thermal blankets in many of the cooler areas. It's really astonishing, but the fireball coming back in, the crews are reported from inside seeing the glowing plasma around them, out the front window, and back overhead even. And yet there are parts of the shuttle that are quite cool in the trailing ends of it. So it's not as clear-cut a case of super hot friction as you'd think.
But the tiles, I gather, dispel heat so dramatically and so quickly they can still be red hot and you can hold them in your hand.
You can do that because it's like walking on a fire walking, as the ashes don't have enough heat in them. They dispel it and they don't put it into your skin. The same thing with the tiles in the shuttle. It's a good design. Getting them to stick was a problem early on, but that's been fixed. Having them damaged by rain is a concern. That's why they don't want to land through rain clouds, because the water droplets could damage them. They are delicate, and when they're there, they work superbly.
Oh, very interesting. Let us turn to the families again. President Bush, who, as you know, came back to the White House from Camp David today, has spoken to the nation. I don't know what's happened to the British Prime Minister, Tony Blair, who was with him, but I do know that the President has been talking to the families of those who were lost today. George Stephanopoulos, here in our Washington Bureau.
Yes, Peter, he has. In fact, Prime Minister Blair went back late last night because he had a summit today with Thabo Mbeki in London. But President Bush did talk to the families shortly before he went out. They were all together in one room with the NASA Administrator Sean O'Keefe. And he said simply to them, the nation's sympathies are with you. I wish I could be there to hug you, to mourn for you, and to be there with you as well. As you might imagine, he's been quite busy throughout the day with this. He's talked to several foreign leaders, in addition to Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, who of course had one of his own astronauts lose his life in this. He's spoken with the French President Jacques Chirac, Vladimir Putin of Russia, Jean Chrétien of Canada, and Vicente Fox of Mexico, all to offer their condolences. I was told that was the sole subject of the calls today, but it's also, I think, should be noted that all of those, except for Prime Minister Sharon, are members of the UN Security Council, which will also be dealing, of course, with the Iraq issue this week. And a senior White House official I spoke to said that there are no plans right now to change the schedule. That Secretary Powell will go forward on Wednesday.
George, let's digress, I think it's fair for a moment, to the Korean crisis and to the Iraqi crisis, because as tragic as this is for the country today, these are issues which cannot wait. How much time is the administration expending on Korea and Iraq today?
Well, Condi Rice, the National Security Advisor, who was up at Camp David with President Bush earlier today, came back with him, and she's in her office right now. And this is something the administration is going to have to deal with every single day. And I think it was Terry Moran who pointed this out earlier. This administration's had an unusually crisis-ridden presidency, even beyond the September 11th events. You now have this explosion, the dual crises now of Iraq and North Korea, and they are going to have to juggle all of them at the same time, and it's not going to be easy.
Do we know whether or not the administration endorses the idea of the weapons inspectors Hans Blick and Mohammed Baradei going back to Iraq as the Iraqis have requested?
Well, and not only have the Iraqis requested, I did see a bulletin earlier this morning that Hans Blix would go on February 8th. The president's general attitude towards all this is that it's not productive, that until Saddam Hussein comes forward and actually puts forward the weapons, everything else is just talk. What he's adamantly against is any negotiations between Hans Blix and Mohammed al-Baradi and the Iraqis, and that's something they come down very hard on.
Now, we've been talking a lot about the ability of the nation to see and hear what's been going on today. John McWethy, who I'll get to in just a second, reported on our broadcast last night that we have seen the Koreans moving nuclear material from one building to another, implying that they've moved up the ladder just a touch of nuclear preparation. What's the White House saying about that today?
Well, what they've said so far is that the pictures are not conclusive. They've tried to downplay the significance of the pictures so far. They are facing some more pressure, though, today, Peter. Senators Tom Daschle, the Democratic leader in the Senate, Joe Biden, the Democratic leader of the Foreign Relations Committee, and Carl Levin, the Democratic leader of the Armed Services Committee, have released a letter to President Bush today demanding more of an explanation and more briefings on what's happened in North Korea. They seem particularly upset by a report that appeared in the Washington Post this morning that the administration was not forthcoming with the information about the North Korean nuclear program. They might have known about it long before they briefed the Congress, and they're looking for more details.
Precisely. So thanks, George. Let me turn to John McWethy at the Pentagon and stay off the Columbia disaster for just a second. Tell us what you know from there the latest is on North Korea, because you developed that story yesterday.
The administration and, in fact, Congress and some of those who are complaining has been tracking a series of developments in North Korea for more than a month, since the Koreans basically said we're not going to abide by the agreement with the international community anymore. The most recent pictures, which are potentially very disturbing, do indicate that the North Koreans are taking some portion of their 8,000 spent fuel rods and appear to be moving them toward a reprocessing plant. In that plant, the U.S. intelligence analysts believe that you could crush and separate those spent fuel rods, get plutonium, and then create a stockpile of weapons-grade material. The debate here, I think, has to do with whether or not the administration is dealing with what is quite clearly a serious international crisis in North Korea with the same kind of gravity they appear to be focusing on Iraq, and whether or not those priorities are correct. That is the debate. I don't think there is much doubt that North Korea is doing things and has been for some time that are very distressful to everyone who is studying it.
Just, John, in terms of the picture, the satellite pictures which we put on World News Tonight last night, thanks to you, the Pentagon is fairly convinced that what it's seeing is potentially dangerous. The White House wishes to minimize it to some extent. Does the Pentagon feel quite strongly about this?
I don't know that it breaks down quite in the way that you are indicating, Peter. There are different elements within the intelligence community that see different levels of ambiguity, and they want more images and more proof before they can say definitively. But the indications are from all the different intelligence agencies that it appears that they are now starting to remove these spent fuel rods. It is another step up in what is already a very difficult crisis with North Korea.
Okay, John, thanks very much. John McWethy at the Pentagon, George Stephanopoulos in our Washington Bureau. I was going to give you a little bit of a general news summary there at the moment, but if you look at what is happening in the world at the moment, whether it's issues of medical malpractice, which will come up at the beginning of the week, whether it is not their latent concern and reporting in Britain yesterday about having known about Al-Qaeda and a so-called dirty radioactive bomb earlier, whether it is the weapons inspectors having now accepted an invitation to go back to Iraq, as George Stephanopoulos just said, it is all overshadowed today by what has happened to the Columbia. There is, by the way, an enormous amount of information at abcnews.com all the time, and on any subject that gets discussed around here, whether it is the history of the shuttle, whether it is the biographies of the members of the shuttle crew who lost their lives today, whether it's instructions in this case about what to do if you come upon debris in your part of the country. It's all at abcnews.com, including a question and answer there about what one should do with debris, which adds one more piece of information. NASA's been saying for several hours you shouldn't touch anything from the shuttle itself because it may possibly be toxic. put aside all of the absolute urgent need to have each piece of the shuttle in order to reconstruct and understand what happened. But here's another little piece at abcnews.com about the fact that there were various scientific experiments conducting on board. As we have told you, this was a scientific mission, and the scientific community believes that maybe because of its exposure to space, some of the materials used in those scientific experiments have changed and therefore may became much more toxic as the result of their time in space. We are waiting, as I said, for NASA to brief us and answer questions from reporters. I'm not sure whether it's going to be in Houston or at Cape Kennedy. It's going to be at Johnston. It's going to be in Houston in a short while from now. But NASA has, just in the last few minutes, released some videotape which are excerpts of interviews done by some of the members of this crew. And we're going to run several of them now because it will, at the moment, give us all a chance to become a little more familiar with the people who will loom very large in the national life for a long time to come.
We're going to be very, very busy. This is a jam-packed 16 days on orbit. And if it were a jam-packed 8 days on orbit, I just wouldn't have any time probably to look out the window. So at least this way I get an opportunity to smell the smells, see the sights, write down some notes, and bring back some of the experiences to share with people back here on Earth.
So it really doesn't matter what job you have as an astronaut. You just climb right into it and you're right in the middle of it. As someone with a science background, I'm a physician. I think it's pretty darn neat. I think it's really feels like a great privilege to kind of jump in and be right in the middle of it.
So the overall objective in a nutshell, it would be fair to say, is to try to understand or better understand physical processes on Earth.
And I really try to think of my role as one of helping the rest of the crew do their job, trying to make their jobs easier. And if I do my job well, then their job should be just that much easier, and we should have a better time on orbit and have a much more successful mission.
Well, this mission is just extremely exciting, and I still feel very fortunate to be assigned to this mission, not only because it's such a long mission and we get to spend so much time in space, but because we're doing such exciting research. And certainly I don't want to overemphasize the life science research since we're doing so many different things on board, but as a physician, the life science research that we're doing is extremely exciting.
And whenever you talk about space, everybody, not only kids, even us, are thrilled. So it's a great tool to attract students to study science, study technology, and be involved in all this planning and operation of science of space mission.
The flag at half-staff at the Kennedy Space Center as we get a glimpse, a more personal glimpse than we've had throughout today, of the 7 members of the crew, 6 Americans and 1 Israeli. On board STS-107, you could see the code, the identification of their shuttle mission behind them there, and seeing them. Those are interviews done by NASA and distributed widely to the press. There was a time, as some of you will know, when the press used to go en masse, in large numbers, down to the Cape and out to Houston to mission control, to see the astronauts for ourselves, and then it has become just a more acceptable part of life. Those interviews helping us see in person this morning the individuals who have lost their lives on this mission. On the phone with us from California is Anthony Beasley. Mr. Beasley is an astronomer at the California Institute of Technology. And Mr. Beasley, you have a very interesting piece of information about what you saw, if I'm correct, as the shuttle passed over the California coast early this morning.
Yes, sir. That's right. We're actually situated here in eastern California, about 200 miles from the Los Angeles basin. This morning, my wife and I got up early this morning to watch the shuttle pass from west to east here.
With your naked eye or using a telescope?
Just naked eye.
Right.
Just naked eye. And what we saw as it passed was it's quite a bright light passing from west to east. And on that bright light there were small flashes, and after each one of these flashes that we would see that there seemed to be pieces trailing behind the shuttle as it continued moving. And so in the course of a few minutes as it passed from west to east, we saw a number of flashes, and one particularly bright one where, a very sizable light detached from the bright light, which was the shuttle, and sort of fell behind it and started to drop down. So I think the analogy would be that it looked like the shuttle had dropped a flare or something like that.
So are you, I don't mean to ask you to imply something you can't, but as an aside, did you think you were seeing something actually happening, or had you seen the shuttle go by ever before?
I'd never seen it land before. I think that after the first few flashes, I thought to myself that I knew that the shuttle lost tiles as it re-entered, and quite possibly that's what was going on. I think that after the particularly bright event, I started to wonder whether or not things were happening as they should.
And just let me relocate you a second. This is somewhere over the Owens Valley?
That's exactly right.
The Owens Valley is just to the east of the Sierra Nevadas, where California begins to blend into Nevada, right?
That's correct. So the shuttle comes up over the Sierra Nevadas in the west, and then tracks towards the east, and we lose it behind the White Mountains. We have a total visibility of a few minutes.
Exactly. The Owens Valley is precisely between the Sierra Nevadas and the White Mountains, and it's also a place where there are a lot of huge satellite dishes, if I recall, listening to something going on out there. Am I right?
That's right. That's where I work, the Owens Valley Radio Observatory here.
Oh, how very interesting. Could you just hang on one second, because I want to bring Jim Oberg. Is Jim with us still? Jim Oberg?
All right. Yeah, Oberg here.
Jim, Peter, have you heard Mr. Beasley describe what he saw over the Owens Valley?
I'm just hearing that and talking to someone else who has the same account. That's an extraordinary account and very important information. Other people from California have emailed me with similar accounts of pieces coming off. It's unusual. It's never been seen before, and people have watched shuttle entries for 20 years.
Now, what is astonishing to me is we're talking about, I grant you the shuttle is going, 14,000 miles an hour at this point?
Yes.
But we are talking about something that would not have occurred over Texas, if they're accurate, but something considerably farther to the west.
If you're pulling pieces off over California, you're still high enough, the pieces could be coming off, but your drag gets worse the lower you get. And what could be happening is, and this is something that there should be some data on, if the left wing is losing tiles, and if the zipper effect is the old term that people would use, you lose a tile in front, the one behind it then gets torn off one after the other and zips a whole line of them or a section of them. You then have not just overheating in that wing, but you have extra drag. And it's like flying along and having your left wing run into something. It could violently twist the nose of the ship to the left, and that would be all she wrote, because that would be a point where it could be torn apart. So this is an extraordinarily important observation.
Mr. Beasley, you've heard that from an expert. You're also an expert. You're an astronomer, right? Were any of the California Institute of Technology's data gathering systems in the Owen Valley working on this shuttle at all that you know?
No, I don't believe so. I think coincidentally we had some photographers at the observatory here who were in place to photograph the shuttle as it passed by the Owens Valley. And when I spoke to those photographers, I know that they had taken some photographs as the shuttle passed over the Owens Valley. So I think that quite possibly some of that information that Mr. Rover mentioned will be available, and hopefully it will help solve the mystery of what happened here.
Well, these are photographers who were doing telescopic photography or just ordinary photography?
I'm not sure.
Okay. Well, if you could find out, we'd be very grateful to hear from you. We're very grateful to hear this information from you this morning. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Anthony Beasley, who is an astronomer with the California Institute of Technology working out in the Owens Valley, and Jim Oberg, our space analyst in many, many things this morning, telling us this would be very significant. Just repeat for me, Jim, very significant, because it would suggest that this bleed of tiles possibly coming off the shuttle might have occurred earlier than we had believed up until now.
That's right. If this is unusual. I've been collecting reports of visual tracking of shuttles from California through Florida now for many years. I've watched them myself. No one has ever reported pieces coming off a shuttle during entry. in my records. Also, this information would not be available from almost any other source because the NASA's not. There is some radar, some skin track, but these small pieces are probably too small and too close to the shuttle to show up on radar, but they would show up to the visual observers. So this is critically important.
Now let me ask you and Norm Thagard to put that information we've just got together with the following information.